Hello everyone! Today we are continuing the course of lectures on the conception of social safety. In the previous lecture, we familiarized ourselves with the global evolution process. I suppose we refreshed our school knowledge concerning genetics, mutations, and so on. All this will help us grasp the topic of global historical process, which we will now explore on the basis of the knowledge we refreshed in the previous lecture. There exist two views on the emergence of biological species. It is well known that a large number of living organisms disappeared. For instance, dinosaurs, pterodactyls, and so on. But not a single case of the emergence of new biological species has been recorded. Why? For the reason of novelty, man regards himself as the crowning achievement of nature. Many scientists, based on this reason, allege that man is the crowning achievement. However, novelty does not necessarily mean perfection. This is especially true of technology. But it is also a sign of all experimental models. But if this crown becomes too tight for the wearer, it may easily be disposed of. As far as you see, the question concerning the emergence of new species is very important. There are two possible variants for the emergence of new species. The first variant is a cascade of mutations. It is known that a mutation, having reason, can embrace the entire population, part of the population, or it can disappear from the population. Thus, a new species may arise from the old species as a result of a cascade of mutations. But then, a question on the interim stages of man's development arises. As the process of man's development has been a lengthy one, these interim stages should be known to science through well-documented human fossils. But these stages are unknown. However, this process can imply a degradation of species. There are so-called scientific theories stating that man is degrading. But the global evolution process moves in one direction, towards complexity. Do you remember the Caduceus? Snakes crawl only forward. Only stable species exist in the contemporary biosphere. As for interim forms, we do not see them. The second variant of species emergence is a genetic catastrophe, which we considered in the previous videos. Once, some proto-humans, a generation or a few reproductive generations, suffered a genetic catastrophe. Consequently, females give birth to only freaks that belong to Homo sapiens. Those Homo sapiens were genetically closed in relation to those that birthed them. This means infertility of a species, its instability, degeneration and extinction. This is the unidirectional principle of the global evolution process, which moves only towards complexity. The known species of the biosphere, as well as the fossils, tell us that evolution is not a stepless smooth ascension, but it is a multi-stepped ladder, vortex. Every stair of this multi-stepped vortex means a variety of species, where every step is the basis for a next one. This variant ends the question on interim stages and raises a question on what caused the change of the genotype. Now let's talk about the causes and factors of genotype changes. In general terms, two causes can be assumed. The first is natural, physical, and the second is non-natural, divine. Let's look into possible variants. Variant A, a virus, which can bring new information into a genotype. This virus can selectively disorder reproductive cells. For instance, HIV, AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, selectively disorders red blood cells. All these can implement such changes, as a result of which, after conception, a new organism emerges that will belong to a new species. Variant B is an emission of oscillations. Let's recall the Trinity: matter, information, measure, and the fact that all processes in the universe are oscillatory, and these oscillations are very diverse. One should also know that the chromosomal apparatus is an oscillatory system: X chromosome and Y chromosome, and this oscillatory system can emit and perceive oscillations. If there turns up a source of oscillations which impacts the chromosomal apparatus and contains an information code, then these oscillations can cause a transformation of the cells of the chromosomal apparatus. Here is an example from our life. Many people can't bear the sound of iron rubbed against glass or a knife against a plate, as they cringe and writhe with this sound. In the same way, if there is some kind of oscillation which causes the X and Y chromosomes to writhe, then the chromosomal apparatus will change. Such an emission has to be different from other emissions of mutagenic nature, from other ordinary oscillations. This variant is more natural. Aside from variants A and B, there might be some other ones, about which we don't know yet. So we have settled on variants A and B. Now let's ponder and draw analogies. If there is a factor that can distort the chromosomal apparatus, then a question arises: what activates the factor? What's more, this something activates the factor every time the certain stage of biosphere development comes to an end. The knowledge that we possess tells us that the species that breathe oxygen appeared not earlier than the plant world created the atmosphere and the ozone layer. Predators appeared not earlier than herbivores, and so on. To put it another way, the process of biosphere development is analogous to the process of multi-stage rocket launch. Let's take the rocket Proton, which I dealt with throughout my military service. This rocket carries satellites into geostationary orbit, in particular communication satellites. The launching of the rocket consists of a first stage, a second stage, a third stage, a space tug, which is activated over Africa and carries a communication satellite into geostationary orbit, which is over the equator, and the speed of the space tug is related to the speed of the rotation of the Earth. So it's like the satellite is stuck at one point, and it may seem to somebody that it doesn't move at all. How is a satellite carried into the orbit? First, the first stage operates, and upon completion of its work, it falls. Then the second stage also falls down onto the Earth. Then the third one does. Then the space tug falls. And then the satellite is in orbit. But the rocket flies according to the program developed by the human intellect. I mean, scientists develop all this. In this case, a question arises: whose intellect has been ruling the evolution of the biosphere throughout millions of years? Let's draw a parallel between a rocket launch and the development of the biosphere. We have the Archean Aeon, the Proterozoic Aeon, and so on. Throughout each entire period, there was an appearance, first, of some initial life forms, then invertebrates, plants, insects, land animals, fish, and so on. Looking at the last stage, we can see the appearance of man. So here we see stages. That's why I drew the analogy with the rocket launch. However, atheists state that everything came into existence by accident. Let's ask ourselves, if all of this was really an accident, what is the probability of all these accidental appearances in the holistic evolutionary process of the development of the biosphere and flora and fauna on Earth. It seems like there exists the highest intellect who rules everything. The results of these reasoning analogies enable one to come to corresponding conclusions. Through simple reasoning and pondering over the materials of the conception of social safety, one inevitably arrives at the conclusions that a highest mind exists, and this mind, reigning in nature, is immeasurably more powerful than the human mind, and its capabilities are immeasurably greater than the capabilities of man and the collective mind of mankind as a whole. You will also realize that God, the Creator, is not some kind of fiction. By the way, why do you suppose that a person who originally doesn't know anything comes to an understanding that there exists the highest mind, God? Where do all these thoughts come from? Where do discoveries, knowledge, scientific laws originally come from? I believe this is what we should all ponder on. Speaking of God, let's go back to the Quran and have a look at the definition of God again. It reads, God, there is no God except He, the living, the everlasting. Neither slumber overtakes Him, nor sleep. In other words, He doesn't rest. To Him belongs everything in the heavens and on earth. Who is He that can intercede with Him except with His permission? He knows what is before them and what is behind them, so God knows everything. And they, people, cannot grasp any of His knowledge, except as He wills. His throne extends over the heavens and the earth, and their preservation does not burden Him. He is the Most High, the Great. As we see, this definition tells us that people get knowledge from above. And all these discoveries, epiphanies, come to the people only with the permission of the Creator. Here is an example. Everyone must have heard that an apple fell on Isaac Newton's head, as a result of which he had an epiphany. Newton formulated this law, but before him, this law already existed in the universe. Newton was just the one who realized this law. The same thing concerns all other knowledge. In this regard, I'd like to say something about intellectual property. Does man really discover, invent something? Or is he just a conduit of certain knowledge in the life of society? As far as you can see, all this is a reflection of the design of the highest intellect, what people call God. But God Himself gives every person proof of His existence. How? A person receives proof of God's existence when he, the person, asks, appeals to God. I have already told you the story about my friend who got a message from the highest intellect in his dream, thanks to which he figured out who had stolen his money. This is one of the examples. You should also appeal to God, who talks to people in the language of life circumstances. If you are truly attentive to the events in your life, you will see clues that can come in your dreams, but not only in dreams. By the way, there are such people that acquire the Holy Spirit. These people directly speak to God and receive revelations. Such people are named prophets. Throughout history, there have been a few people of this kind, at least those who we know. There are also mediums who are given revelations. All this raises a question. Who do these revelations come from? In one of our following lectures, we will touch upon the topic of egregors, and this will help us find answers to this question. God gives proof of His existence to everyone who appeals to Him. Simply speaking, if a person follows an unprivate path in his life, he encounters problems, small and large, and if he doesn't pay attention to them, these small and large problems become worse. But if he understands clues from above, he corrects his way. What I've just said, we will look into this more deeply in one of our following lectures, in order to make it clearer for you. God's reply to a person's appeal appears in the statistics of various circumstances happening to the person. This is what I want to say using the aforementioned examples. Let's make a conclusion. So, there exists the Earth's biosphere and its matrix of possible states. Beforehand, the biosphere was changing. The global evolution process was ongoing, as a result of which flora and fauna emerged. We conditionally depict this matrix as a vortex. In fact, it should be a vortex of stepped edges in the picture. This matrix, the matrix of development of Earth's biosphere, is a fragment of the pan-universal matrix of possible states, and this matrix is inscribed in the pan-universal matrix, in the pan-universal measure. The universe is a multi-measured probabilistic matrix of possible states of matter, and all rhythms of the cosmos impact Earth's biosphere. Firstly, it is the solar system that has a huge impact on Earth's biosphere. Meanwhile, other galaxies impact the solar system. As far as one can see, the pan-universal measure has an impact on the matrix of the biosphere, and there is a continuous process of information reflecting from the universe into the biosphere, and from the biosphere into the universe through feedback lines. Mainly, it is oscillations that are transmitted, oscillations such as light, electromagnetic waves, and so on. So, there is a universe that exerts its influence on the biosphere of the planet Earth, just as the Earth, through its vibrations, exerts effects on the processes taking place in the universe. From the standpoint of the sufficiently general theory of governance, the universe is a subject of governance, while the Earth's biosphere is an object. So the subject has a governing impact on the object and determines the quality of governance through feedback lines. This scheme demonstrates that reflection, governance, and self-governance are the mutually nested processes and concepts. This is why we need to introduce a new concept, the highest hierarchical encompassing governance, which is carried out by God towards the biosphere and which flows through its encompassing matrix of possible states. So, the highest hierarchical encompassing governance rules the processes of Earth's biosphere through an informational impact, but self-governance proceeds within the framework of the entire pan-universal measure. To put it another way, there are processes within the framework of the biosphere, but they proceed within the framework of God's allowance. You cannot go beyond God's allowance. You cannot drag yourself against God, the highest intellect. If you go beyond God's allowance, you will end up in a bad way. I'd like to say that the pan-universal measure triggers the factor which gives rise to an appearance of new species in the biosphere. We don't know all the details of this factor, although we can describe it in general terms. However, a vast majority of scientists and politicians avoid a direct discussion of this topic. Speaking of scientists, I should admit that there are some scientists that are coming to an understanding of God's existence. But they do not call a spade a spade. Instead, they prefer using other names: the cosmic mind, information field, the universe. In the conception of social safety, we, however, state that God exists. Measure, the pan-universal measure of possible states, possesses a quality which many often ascribe to God. God is in everything, and everything is in God. Measure is also in everything, and everything is in measure. Measure is in all kinds of matter, in its various states, and it is inseparable from information. This thesis, as an initial category, possessing the key quality, joins science and religion. Therefore, the conception of social safety is built on the foundation of philosophy, based on the inseparable trinity, which removes the contradictions between science and religion. Do you see what this all means? This means removing the contradictions between different religious confessions, avoiding war, and so on. This is a really serious thing. Let's look at pantheism. It is when nature is regarded as God. In other words, in pantheism, they regard measure, God's predetermination in its entirety, as God. Religions, rejecting pantheism, regard measure as the most general means of governance of the universe from the side of God, through which the universe and energy informational flow comes, the flow that Church names Holy Spirit. You know, when these lectures are read in schools and universities, students treat this information the way it is. They perceive it with a great natural interest. Speaking of older generations, when this information goes into their psyche, where there are no empty files, they react in a different way. What I mean to say is, older generations have difficulty perceiving and admitting this information. God is the trinity of matter, information, measure, which is expressed in the laws of nature, as these laws were created by God. We don't know all of these laws yet. We are just getting to know them. Here you have to understand that these laws are a pressing factor towards us. We therefore cannot neglect these laws, as neglecting them means going against God. In the sufficiently general theory of governance, we look into the things such as the goal of governance, the vector of governance, and the stability of governance. If you don't have these concepts integrated in your conceptual circle, it is hard to understand the materials of the conception of social safety. Any kind of governance contains a goal, always. The goal can be good or bad. When information is passed, that means there exists a goal. What I mean is, if there is an informational impact on us, this impact always has a goal. Looking at these things from this point of view, we can comprehend that the existence of humankind is not meaningless, but has a certain predetermination. And this predetermination is conditioned by the particular measure of possible states of Earth's biosphere, as well as the pan-universal measure. I mean that we are under the impact of laws of nature, of that informational state, in which we all are. And this impact comes from the biosphere, as well as all the rhythms of the cosmos. Speaking of humankind, I should say that every person has a predestination and his own individuality. By the way, man's individuality is imprinted in his unique fingerprints, the corneas of his eyes. All this means that no two people are the same. Every person is God's unique child, whose life is meaningful. And the meaning of his life, his predestination, a person can figure out from God by entering a dialogue with Him. Using the language of radio technology, a person must enter coherence with Him. Speaking the language of religion, it is acquiring the Holy Spirit. That is what we will talk about in our next lectures. Man's skills are conditioned by genetics. Humankind is distinguished among other species by articulated speech, thinking, intentions on the basis of prediction, and implementing all this in his activity. As humankind can meddle with nature, we can do two things. We can build a type of culture corresponding to God's design, the pan-universal measure. Or we can perish as we have already built a type of culture that does not correspond to God's design. And we are getting sucked deeper in this inferno. So, either we fulfill the goals God has towards us, or we drag ourselves against God, refusing to fulfill these goals. I have a question for our viewers. How do we live? Aren't we going against God's will? The culture we live in oppresses our own genetics and destroys the biosphere. The result can be a total collapse where the civilization will be on the edge of extinction. Now let's look into types of culture. When Homo sapiens were introduced as a supersystem into Earth with its pre-existing flora and fauna, their world perceptions and skills were animalistic, close to those of their ancestors. Man followed his instincts, conditioned and unconditioned reflexes. That's it, nothing more. However, he was distinguished from animals by his genetically determined potential for cultural development that he would master in the future. Here, I drew a picture of the genetically determined potential of the development of culture. This point of view is also provided by archaeological data. But there are also other data, such as the myth of the expulsion from the Garden of Eden and Great Flood, after which people became wild. Speaking in general terms, humankind can carry three types of culture and live, not forever, but for a while, in three types of civilization. The first type is a technocratic civilization and culture. This is the modern culture that we all live in. In general terms, it is the civilization in which humankind has become slaves of technologies. Imagine Moscow or another megapolis where, all of a sudden, water disappears. Or it can be electricity, central heating in severe winter. What will happen to this megapolis? As far as you see, people have become hostages of devices. They cannot live without their devices or even cook food. So, people have become human-like robots. They are subordinate to the technocratic civilization, which rules them. Man is not free in his choice, as he is subordinate to the rhythms of technosphere. The second type of culture is technological. It is when technologies serve people, but do not reign over them. This type of culture requires another type of psyche in people. The third type of culture is biological. It is the civilization where culture is orientated on mastering by man his genetically determined potential. It is when a person lives in harmony with nature, without any crutches of modern civilization. A good example of what I said was Porfiry Kornevich Ivanov, who lived in harmony with nature. He fortified himself from the cold, went barefoot on morning grass, and so on. He lived in sync with the rhythms of the biosphere, the cosmos. Nowadays, he is shown as a Russian mystic who created his own cult, which is actually not true. If there was a biological civilization on Earth before, there would be no tracks of it left today. However, we have myths, such as the Golden Age, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and so on. After what we have looked into, you should come up with a question. What is good in our civilization in relation to the mastering of the genetically determined potential? Speaking of man's genetically determined potential, there are some people who can work out hard mathematical combinations in their minds. But a vast majority uses calculators and computers to do that. Once I had an experience when I was doing my military service on the Baikonur Cosmodrome. At that time, we were working with Japanese cosmonauts on the Cosmodrome. I spotted an interesting thing. When doing calculations, the Japanese use calculators all the time. In particular, when the Japanese needed to do some calculations using the measurement unit of Napier, they, of course, used their special calculators, which we didn't have at that time in Russia. When one of my colleagues took a slide rule to do calculations, the Japanese looked at him with such respect. What I mean to say is, the Japanese couldn't do with the help of their mind what we could do. It was something unusual for them. As far as you see, instead of our determined potential, we all create crutches. If you look at our children, they all have their eyes glued to cell phones and computers. Nature does not exist for them. They're all hostages of the technosphere. Therefore, it is vitally important to understand what is blago in culture and what is not, and root it out. What exactly holds people back from opening their genetically determined potential? This is something to ponder on. Next, we need to look into specifics of a person's formation process. Here is an elementary picture. A person is born. He grows up, and culture forms a physical and spiritual individual, mainly from the time of conception to entry into adulthood. The person is under various influences: his family, his kindergarten, his school, his parents, books, the radio, TV, and so on. All this has a governing impact on his matureness as a person. What kind of governing impacts or ideals does all this contain? Looking around, you can see what ideals all this has. As a result of this culture in which we all live, we have what we have: a subhuman scum, a sexual digestive machine. Let's talk about the upbringing of a child. Many believe that upbringing starts from birth. This is a mistake. I should say that conception is a very serious time. The formation of a child begins not from the moment he is born, but from conception. It is true, as the child is not only an amalgamation of spermatozoid and egg cell, but also an interaction of two people's biofields. In Rus, the young always ensured chastity before marriage. The thing is, during a sexual act, the biofields of two people interact, which imprints in the biofields of these people who engage in sexual acts just for fun. And as a rule, they will have other partners for a family and children. This imprinting of the sexual act will have an impact on their future children. We call it telegony. Here is the story I know. One female Russian student was involved with an African man before eventually marrying her husband. After a while, they broke up. She married a Russian, and they conceived a child. Soon after that, she gave birth to a baby with dark skin. Why? Because the sexual acts she had with the African man had imprinted in her biofield. The same thing concerns animals. For instance, when horse mates with a zebra, they do not produce offspring. However, if that horse mates with a horse, they can have striped offspring. As you see, this informational impact exists, and it is objective, because conception is not only an amalgamation of a spermatozoid and egg cell, but also an interaction of biofields. Sometimes, parents cannot understand where their child got some specific feature from. He got that from all those men his mother previously had intercourse with. So, this child has many fathers in the line of biofields. The same thing concerns men. Their sexual acts with women also imprint in their biofields. So, we say that culture forms a person, as well as his psyche, mainly before adulthood. For this reason, when evaluating a person, it is really important to pay attention to many things. what kind of environment he was raised in, how he studied, what kind of parents he had, and other things. This is why childhood is vitally important. Remember that saying I mentioned before: if little Ivan didn't learn, big Ivan will never learn. People can change, but it is really hard. Looking at modern parents, you can guess how upbringing takes place in their families. Besides, most families do not live with their parents. Children don't have a chance to communicate with their grandparents. We state that there is a need to live in the continuity of generations, so that the accumulated experience is passed on to the child. Speaking about life in modern cities, it is not possible for a large family to live in this kind of apartment that we have nowadays. In Russia, we also have these problems. Someone can object, saying that there are some people in our country who still follow their customs and pay heed to their parents, like in the culture of the Caucasus region. In fact, this is only of a declarative nature. So culture, as well as its attributes, are being destroyed. Let's sum up. Kindergarten, school, and other things influence a child's matureness as a human. This process takes place on the basis of a personal genetically determined potential. Everyone has his own unique mission to master his own potential. A person can master the entire potential or some part of it due to the quality of upbringing, education, and so on. In this regard, I'd like to go back to the Jewish ritual of circumcision on the 8th day, which has a negative impact on mastering of the genetically determined potential. It is really a terrible mechanism that appeared during the Sinai trek. Let's consider another possible matrix for man. The formation of man's unique genetically determined potential is conditioned by the Biosphere matrix and biorhythms of the cosmos. Man is inscribed in this matrix. Speaking of astrology, he is born under certain oscillatory processes. Even conception takes place under certain oscillations and biorhythms of the cosmos, but not only as a result of an amalgamation of a spermatozoid with an egg cell and an interaction of biofields. Modern astrologists should take all this into consideration, because all these biorhythms have an impact on man's formation and future matureness at the moment of conception. Every person has his own matrix of possible states, what we normally call destiny, fate. Many suppose that destiny is predetermined, but this is not true. Every person can change, completely change his destiny within the boundaries of the pan-universal matrix. It is also important to have self-mastery skills, to rule yourself and your life. Moreover, you have to stay in a constant dialogue with God. Man's genetically determined potential is a certain particular measure, which every person needs to fill with a specific content throughout his life. Everyone has to build his life so that he can master his entire genetically determined potential. Now look around at all people. Do we master our genetically determined potentials? Of course not. Why? Because culture does not contribute to it. What conclusion can we make? We have to form a child's skills at the right time. Or, as I have already said, little Ivan didn't learn, big Ivan will never learn. We must also remember the following things: kindergarten, school, books, parents. Everything tremendously influences a child. We must also remember that the genetic program has time-restricted boundaries, within which man can master certain things. Remember that example with Mowgli, who was raised by animals, and couldn't learn to speak when he appeared in human society. Although he looked the same, one head, two arms, and so on, he, however, failed to learn to speak. Why? Because genetics has time-restricted boundaries. This is why the period before adulthood is so important. If there are no necessary conditions in the environment at a certain period of time, then the genetically determined potential will never open. Analyzing the current situation in Russia, we see that most children already have huge problems before adulthood, which also result in children becoming homeless, criminals, and so on. Who is to blame for that? This is all a result of Malin-Ravia's governance. Can you imagine what society we will have if we don't take any measures now? In this vein, I often recall the Russian song "The Sandpit Generals," which has the following words: "Why did you leave me? Why? I'm your brother, I'm a human." These people are deprived of many things. The rich want them to condone, accept their miserable destiny. But this will never happen. Look at the rich in Russia. Most of them have made a fortune illegally. They are mafias. Look what kind of cottages, villas they build for themselves, which often look like castles, surrounded by barbed wire, with security guards, with machine guns around the perimeters. They make a fortune at the expense of those who they want to accept their miserable destiny. Again, this will never happen. Let's look around. It's already the third millennium, but people are still killing each other. What is it? It is a manifestation of the satanic conception. Let's talk about national cultures. When Homo sapiens came into existence, the initial ways of development were conditioned by matrices of genetically determined potential possibilities. In this picture, we can see Earth. Let's say this one is the matrix of development of humankind. Let's say here we have the genetically determined potential of Europe, Russia, Japan, and so on. This development takes place within the boundaries of the highest hierarchical encompassing governance, God. But initially, there are various possibilities. Lev Gumilov created the theory of ethnogenesis, in which he stated that the only determining factor in formation of man and culture is the environment where the person lives. He is right about this aspect. But it is not only the environment that has an impact on man. Otherwise, it sounds like man is deprived of intellect, culture, and so on. Speaking of the environment, there is a difference between a person brought up in a desert, as he is used to looking at the horizon, and a person brought up in a forest, as he is used to looking at the stars. It is true that the environment has an impact on man, but it is not the only factor. Another factor is the culture in which he lives. Culture is also governed. What I mean to say is, at first, possibilities of mastering the GDP, genetically determined potential, were different and were under the impact of many factors. Different in what way? For instance, Japan is an island of its own restrictions and is surrounded by the sea, and so on. Russia, for instance, is a completely different environment with lots of lakes, rivers, mountains, and so on. There exist different possibilities, far more possibilities in terms of mastering the pan-universal measure, as well as the GDP. This is why the Russian language is far richer than any other language. In one of our videos, we introduced some Russian concepts, which do not exist in any language, except for some Slavic languages. These concepts reflect objective reality. With the help of the Russian language, one can adequately describe creation in a way that one cannot do in other languages. However, I should say that the matrices were not conditioned by the direct influence of the natural geographic environment, because specimens adapt to the local environmental conditions. This is why the possibilities of the matrices were different. All this predetermined the development of culture in different regions of the planet at early stages. The possibilities of mastering the pan-universal measure, as well as the GDP, were different also for the reason of social organization, borrowing from other cultures, the impact of the highest hierarchical encompassing governance. In this regard, you should look at the Russian multinational culture. Russia consists of many peoples and cultures that interact with each other, borrow the best from each other, and create the common unique culture. Thus, we have this multicultural diversity. This is what we mean when we say that Russia is the culture of measure. Russia is like a mold of the whole planet. Russia is the country where not a single culture has ever been suppressed or destroyed. The friendship of peoples was cultivated in the USSR under Stalin, and so on. The social organization also has an impact. For instance, in Rus, before the times of Orthodox Christianity, there was no slavery. There is another important thing that one should know. Culture is not inherited through genetics. Everything that impacted the cultures stabilized them and saved their identities. The carrier of culture is not the species, but the social organization of this species. You will never find this in books. Thus, culture is that factor of the environment which impacts people. Therefore, culture as a factor of the environment has an impact, a governing impact on all species. For instance, hunting by man. It also has a governing impact on man, wars, genocide, and on the biocynosis on the whole. Now, let's recall that part where we talked about the correlation of frequencies and their impact on the biological species and consequences for the species if it fails to adapt to this impact. If the rate of change of culture parameters is low, in this case, the species has to adapt to more stable parameters of culture: food, clothes, housing, religions, and so on. This, in turn, will put the brakes on mastering the GDP. What conclusion can we make here? The development of culture impacts the reproduction of generations. Unlike animals, man has culture, which implies different formations: mafias, clans, elites, etc. Imposing another culture on people always causes resistance. In the cultural traditions of these people, their social organization, customs, governance, relationships between people, and so on. The matrix of the GDP for these people in the highest hierarchical encompassing governance. God does not approve of an imposition of another culture. He therefore has his governing impact on such actions. Considering all of these, culture exchange, war by means of culture exchange, hardly ever fills the life of peoples with new content. For instance, Native Americans, Eskimos, no matter how others imposed their culture on these peoples, they failed. As a result of this, rooting out of unbeneficial cultures was always accompanied by genocide through narcotics, economy, different state cultural programs, and so on. In this sense, our Russian multinational culture is not beneficial for the conquerors waging a cold war against our country. They are carrying out genocide towards us through narcotics, vodka, beer, Economy. Look, we are the richest country in the world. We have everything. However, they implement such economic programs that are destroying our country with the help of our idiotic Democrats. Now, let's talk about the process of thinking. Childhood is determined by an increase in an amount of non-genetic information. I told you before that a kitten, for example, just needs to master information that this kitten can get from its mom. As for man, he needs to master a lot of books, information that was mastered before him, and so on. Therefore, articulated speech is an informational system of coding visual thinking, picture thinking. Here we see a person. He has receptors, eyes, ears, nose, and so on. He looks at the surrounding world and sees the sun, birds singing. He perceives all these phenomena of nature, as well as social phenomena, strikes, wars, and vests these phenomena with appropriate words. Everything around him, man vests with certain words, unlike animals that can utter only species sounds. In other words, man uses speech, but not gestures or body language that he used before. A cat, for instance, demonstrates with its body and sounds what it wants. If you see anybody waving their hands, trying to explain something to you, this means the person cannot properly express his thoughts through speech. This is a sign of that person's incapability and incompetence to vest his thoughts with appropriate words. Speech also gives us a chance to pass on information mastered by our ancestors, but that is not inherited through genetics. A generation masters some information, then passes it to another one, who, in their turn, supplements it and passes on. This process is endless. Therefore, there is always an increase in non-genetic information. Now, this factor of the environmental pressure has led to the fact that teachers in our country state that education must be prolonged 12 years instead of 10. Arms, speech, and ability to predict possible variants, intentions on the basis of prediction, enabled man to begin protecting himself from the pressure of the natural environment by means of creating a man-made environment. Animals, for instance, cannot protect themselves from nature the way man can. Man first began to build wooden huts, then wooden houses, later concrete ones, and so on. First, man had to make fire, then he made fireplaces. Nowadays, we also have radiators, central heating. After a while, this man-made environment began to suppress the natural environment, first in the lives of a few, and then on a planetary scale. Look what types of vehicles, planes, trains we have nowadays. All this suppresses the natural environment. Is it good or bad? We already talked about this. We have to understand what is good and bad in every single situation. How do we have to look at phenomena? We have to look at things through the prism of whether this enables man to fulfill his GDP or not. Nobody says that we have to reject the technosphere or go back the primal way of life. Nothing of this kind. But we have to understand that there exist some things in our way of life that suppress our genetics, and they do not help us master our GDPs. Therefore, we need to revise, correct, and make things correspondent to God's design through a dialogue with Him. Here is another thing I'd like to mention. Not having mastered the ability of abstract logical thinking, man mastered the ability to lie and to delude himself. Studies have shown a person lies with the help of the left hemisphere. Meanwhile, The right hemisphere is incapable of lying. What I have said now is very important. Look at what we have. Looking at a phenomenon, man realizes its essence, but he vests it with his own word, not the appropriate one. Shortly speaking, he lies. Thus he has an informational impact on others, which does not correspond to the objective reality. So to say, he introduces an inversion in the perception by others of the surrounding world. Languages of all nations in the world are part of the pan-universal measure. Imagine if Joseph Stalin, during the war, had stated, "Our cause is left, the enemy will be defeated." It's hard to imagine that. However, our Communist Party states that they are leftists, a left wing. In spite of this, they suppose that they are the inheritors of the USSR, including Stalin. This is such nonsense. I told you before what the root prav, privacy, means in the Russian language. As for the word left, we have different phrases using this word that mean connected with lies, avoiding privacy. In general, there exist only two conceptions, the private one and the unprivate one, as I told you before. Speaking of all these political parties that we have, they all just stand for the interests of their clans. But some of them state this openly. The most dangerous ones are those who do not state it openly. They are Trotskyists. Karl Marx invented such a teaching that could never lead to true communism. Beforehand, we already looked into the three parts of Marxism. We will go back to it later again. What I mean to say is that a lie is always an unprivate cause, even if it is a white lie. The private cause is always telling the truth. This is the fundamental thing of the conception of social safety, as well as the book "Мертвая вода", Dead Water. This is why the conception is hushed up by even those representatives of political parties and movements who have read it. "Мертвая вода", Dead Water, especially is hushed up. Why especially this book? Because it reveals the lie, and this book contains criticisms on all issues. That's why they hush it up. An ability to lie leads to an ability in other people to lie, and an inadequate comprehension of the objective reality. All this distorts and destroys other people's personal measures. One mustn't lie. Let's sum up. The ability to lie and delude oneself has become a factor of cultural development. Unfortunately, it has become the dominant factor. Look how our leaders, officials, lie to us. As for people, they understand this lie, but they accept it, swallow it. You know, in this regard, we have a Russian saying, "They pee right in the eyes of people, but people regard this pee as God's due." This factor of lie has become a factor of the cultural, and as a consequence, a factor of the global historical process, where the historical process is a process of cultural development in the global evolution process, the factor of the biosphere development. If culture is built on deception, then it has a negative impact on the development of the biosphere. All this has led to the global ecological crisis in particular, as well as other crises, the collective name for which in the scientific world is the global system crisis. The main factor of this crisis comes from deception. We have finished looking into the global historical process. Next, we will look into the crowd elite society, the way social relations were created. See you next time.